The chair beneath me was hard, old wood, worn smooth by other girls who had sat here before me. My hands sat folded in my lap, and I stared at them instead of her face. The window was cracked open, just enough to let in the smell of turned soil and the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere behind me, counting seconds I couldn't stop. This was the third time. No one had told me there would be a third time. My name is Aria. I grew up Amish, and this is where I tell the truths I carried quietly for years. If you've ever felt like you were being measured by a standard no one explained to you, stay a while. Subscribe if this story finds you, and tell me, has anyone ever tested you by rules you were never given? I was 19 years old the first time someone told me I wasn't ready. I remember the words more than the reason, the way shame does that to you, sanding down the details and leaving only the ache behind. The woman who told me was not unkind. She spoke softly, the way our women always did, folding disappointment into gentleness so it wouldn't cut too deep. But it cut anyway. I walked home that afternoon with my apron still smelling of the bread I'd baked for the visit, bread that apparently hadn't been enough, though no one ever said exactly what would have been. There is no single word in our world for what happened to me over those months. We didn't call it an inspection, not out loud. It was something quieter than that, something built from visits and questions and long silences where an older woman would watch you fold linens or answer a question about scripture, and somewhere in that watching, a decision was being made about whether you were ready to be a wife. It happened over weeks, sometimes months, through conversations that felt like nothing at the time and everything in hindsight. No one explained the criteria. You were simply expected to know, or to become, whatever it was they were looking for. The first failure came wrapped in talk about my cooking, though I understood later it was never really about the cooking. My biscuits that day had been a little dense, my kitchen a little disorganized, and the woman watching me had noted it with a small, careful frown. But I had cousins whose biscuits were far worse than mine who passed without a single mention of flour or butter. It wasn't the bread. It was something else, something I couldn't name yet, some quality of readiness they thought I lacked and couldn't quite explain, even to themselves. That night I sat on my bed and pulled my mother's old quilt around my shoulders, tracing the faded pattern with my fingers the way I'd done since I was small. It smelled like cedar and years. And it steadied me in a way words couldn't. I didn't cry. Amish girls learn early that tears are for private rooms, not shared ones, and even alone, I held mine back out of a habit I couldn't explain. I only sat there, wrapped in something older than my shame, wondering what part of me needed fixing that I couldn't see myself. My friend Sarah passed her first evaluation without any trouble at all. She was 18, a year younger than me, and when she told me, she seemed almost embarrassed by how easy it had been. One afternoon, one conversation, and it was decided she was ready. I remember feeling something twist in my chest that I didn't want to name, because it wasn't quite jealousy and it wasn't quite grief. It was closer to confusion. If readiness could come so easily to her, what exactly was missing in me? Years later, Sarah would tell me something that changed how I understood that whole season, but I didn't know that yet, not that night. The second failure came 4 months after the first, and this time the language was different. It wasn't my hands they questioned, but my quietness, or rather, the lack of it. I had asked a question during one of the visits, a simple one, about how something was meant to be done, and I watched the woman's face shift almost imperceptibly. "Too forward," she said later, gently, to my mother. "Not quite submissive enough." I remember thinking that just months before, my silence had been the problem, and now my voice was too. The rules seemed to move depending on who was measuring me, and I had no way of knowing which version of myself I was supposed to be. I didn't tell my mother how much that second failure wounded me. I smiled at supper, helped with the dishes, sang the hymns on Sunday like nothing in me had cracked. This was its own kind of training, I think now, the art of carrying disappointment so quietly that no one around you ever has to see the weight of it. I had learned it well by 19. I would learn it even better by the time I turned 20, though I didn't yet know a third test was coming, or that it would ask something of me I hadn't prepared for at all. In the weeks before the third visit, I thought often of the man I was meant to marry, a quiet, steady person named Eli who I'd known since we were children. I didn't know it then, but he was carrying his own version of this fear, his own quiet evaluations happening in barns and workshops among the men, questions about whether he could provide, whether he was steady enough, whether he understood what a marriage required. We never spoke of it to each other. We were both too afraid, I think, of what it might mean to admit we didn't feel ready at all, that the whole system meant to prepare us had instead left us both privately, separately, terrified. The third visit came on a gray afternoon in early spring, the kind of day where the cold hadn't quite let go and the warmth hadn't quite arrived. I remember dressing carefully that morning, though I no longer believed my dress or my hair had anything to do with what would be decided in that room. Something in me had gone quiet by then, not peaceful exactly, but resigned, the way you go still when you've stopped expecting a different outcome. I walked to the house with my hands folded the same way they always were, and I sat in the same chair, and I waited. The room was unchanged. The same hardwood beneath me, the same window cracked open to let in the smell of thawing earth, the same clock ticking its slow rhythm behind my shoulder. But when I finally looked up, really looked, at the woman across from me, I noticed something I hadn't let myself see the first 2 times. There was softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, or perhaps it had always been there and I had been too afraid to see past my own fear to find it. She didn't ask me to cook that day. She didn't test my scripture or watch my hands for signs of readiness. Instead, she asked me how I was sleeping, and when I told her the truth, poorly, and with worry, she nodded like she understood something I hadn't said out loud. Then she told me something I have carried with me every day since. She said the first 2 times had never really been about me. They had been about her own fear, and the fear of the women before her, that a marriage entered too quickly, too unprepared, would break the way they had seen other marriages break, quietly, over years, without anyone stepping in soon enough to help. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you've stepped on for years without ever picking up. It wasn't about my biscuits, or my silence, or my question that one afternoon. It was about a community carrying old wounds forward, trying to protect the next generation from pain they themselves had lived through, and doing it in the only way they knew how, through watching, and waiting, and hoping that vigilance could somehow prevent what experience had taught them to fear. I didn't feel angry in that moment. I felt something closer to sorrow, for all of us, for every girl who had sat in that chair before me. Sarah told me, years later, sitting in my kitchen with her own children playing in the next room, that her easy pass had never meant she was more ready than I was. It had simply been timing, a season when the women doing the evaluating were tired, or distracted, or less afraid than they'd been the year before. She said she'd carried a quiet guilt about it for years, watching me struggle through what she'd skated past without effort. Hearing that untangled something in me I hadn't known was still knotted. It had never been a measure of worth at all. It had only ever been a mirror held up to someone else's fear. Both things were true, I've come to understand, the way both things so often are in the world I grew up in. There was real care in that process, a genuine wish to protect young couples from entering marriage unprepared, born from love as much as fear. And there was real harm in how inconsistently it was carried out, how it left girls like me carrying shame that was never truly ours to hold. I don't think the women who tested me were cruel. I think they were frightened, in their own quiet way, and frightened people often measure others by standards they can't fully explain, even to themselves. After Eli and I married, we finally spoke of it, late one night by lamplight, each of us confessing what we'd never told the other, his quiet dread in the workshop, mine in that hard wooden chair. We laughed a little, and then we didn't, because underneath the laughter was a shared grief for 2 young people who had faced their fears alone when they could have faced them together. That conversation became the real beginning of our marriage, more than any inspection ever was. It taught me that readiness was never something someone else could measure. It was something 2 people built quietly, together, in the years after the tests had ended. If you have ever failed a test you didn't understand, measured by rules no one explained to you, I want you to hear this clearly. It was very likely never about you at all. Somewhere behind every harsh judgment is usually a frightened person trying, imperfectly, to protect something they love. That doesn't erase the hurt, but it can soften it, the way understanding always does when we finally see the whole shape of a thing. You were not broken. You were simply standing in front of someone else's fear, and mistaking it for your own reflection.